All right. Thank you all for joining us this morning at our first FC Build conference. Some great energy on my last panel, and I'm really looking forward to this one as well. Special thanks to our speakers, Edith Harbaugh and Tian Zhou, for joining us. Running a high growth company in the current environment leaves very few opportunities to rise up above the daily grind. So we're particularly grateful for you all joining us. So quickly, by way of background, Edith is co-founder and CEO of LaunchDarkly, which she started 6 years ago, after more than a decade as a product manager and product director across both consumer and enterprise companies. Teen is the co-founder and CEO of Zora, which he started in 2007, following 8.5 years at Salesforce, which he joined as the 11th employee when the company was still operating out of a house on Telegraph Hill in the city. So let's see, you both began your careers as individually contributing engineers. You're both deeply technical, and you both eventually moved into leadership roles as founders. So I'd love to kick things off by just getting your quick advice on what you would give in terms of advice to engineers who are considering making that transition to starting a company. Edith, if you wouldn't mind just kicking us off, that'd be great.
Yeah, I was just impressed for a second about Tian being 11 at Salesforce. Wow. So I think I started off as an engineer designing systems, and I got very frustrated basically at designing systems that people didn't actually use. So if you're an engineer and you're building something and you put a lot of effort into it and you even perhaps got a couple patents like I did, and then it just, there's no pickup in the market, that's incredibly wasteful and harmful. So that's why I became a product manager, is to try to zoom in on stuff that people actually wanted to use. And from that experience, I actually founded LaunchDarkly, which helps engineers and product managers iterate on features, release them quickly, and figure out the right things to build.
Yeah.
Right on.
So Richard McAniff, who was one of the executives at Microsoft during the Gates Ballmer era, I spent some time at VMware. He once told me his formula for hiring product managers was go into the engineering organization and find the English majors, the journalism majors, and so I think you just, if you find yourself basically saying, look, there's nothing wrong with taking an engineering track and being a CTO, just building a great piece of technology, but if you find yourself, like I did, just wondering, hey, what's on the other side? What are customers doing, right? Hungry to talk to customers, talk to companies, right, and seeing what they do. So early on in my career, I was really curious, and so I spent a lot of time in the field, if you will, and I actually wound up even carrying a bag, and so that was sort of I was a sales engineer at first, was sort of quasi-sales, quasi-engineer, and decided I really wanted to carry a bag and understand how that feels like. And so I would say, look, if you're engineering and eventually you want to start a company, move around a bit, right? Move around a bit. Product management is a natural thing. Sales engineering, I actually do recommend just to try out. And when I look back and I say those years that I did, about 4 years in sales, those were pretty foundational. And because if you're going to start a company, you're going to raise capital, right, from folks like Foundation, right? You know that, right? If you can hire executives, the ability to sell and not try to get somebody to buy your product, right, but really connect with people and provide value. Right. You talk about vision becomes a really important skill.
Yeah,
this notion of moving around the org is exactly right. Sorry, Edith, go for it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's perception as a young engineer that all you have to do is build. The older I get, the more I'm like, okay, you actually have
dreams.
What?
Yeah. Field of dreams, build it and they'll come.
I actually had my own stint in marketing and then managing salespeople. Of even if you built the right thing as a product manager, you still have to tell people about it.
That's right.
Of marketer, and that, I love it. And then you have to actually sell it, which is a whole different set of skills.
Yeah,
I remember having this conversation with David Kelly. I started my career at IDEO, and it was clear he would get some of our biggest accounts by selling them on the idea, and it was very clear to me, as an engineer, an individual contributor at the time, that it was actually always easier to build something that had already been sold than to sell something that had already been built. And so many engineers sort of start the other way around. So what maybe Teen, to start out with, what was the most difficult adjustment that you had to make going from an individual contributor to sort of a manager as you began to kind of grow and scale as an individual?
Gosh, so probably the folks on the phone, high-powered individuals, I joke about it sometimes, are often one of the worst ones to become managers, the hardest, I should say, because what you try to do is you've been rewarded your whole career, your whole life, right, by just being the person to execute. And now you're executing bigger and bigger things. And you could probably, power your way through managing 5, 10, 15 people just because, the strength of your vision, your execution, your knowledge, your expertise. But eventually you got to learn how to work through people. And so there's a bit of a more distance away from the actual work. And I think the magic is you don't want to get to a place where you feel like, I'm so distant from the work that I really don't know about the work. The magic is actually, how do you get more distance from the work and actually know what's getting done? Right. And so if you have to talk through people, what are the questions that you have to ask and know? Is this feature being built right? Is it being built with high quality? Right. You can't do a code review. Then what are the questions that you would have to ask? Now you imagine having to ask a second line manager or a third line manager the same type of thing. And then eventually, if you want to do this journey and run a company, you're going to have to run a cross-functional role. And so eventually you're going to be managing people that are just experts in their area far beyond what you would know, right? Because you didn't grow up in that functional area. And that's one of the things that are most uncomfortable for folks. So that's why I still go back to, if you sort of spend your early career, move around, understand the functions, right? Get a generalist view and get a perspective of how it all fits together. The higher up you go in the organization, the more critical that skill actually does become.
Great advice. Edith, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I actually got a systems engineering degree. So I think the jump from being an IC to being a manager and then a manager of managers or manager of manager of managers of managers of managers, depending on how many hurdles you have, is you're designing a system. You're designing a system where you have engineers who are building things, product managers who are taking requirements, marketers who are figuring out how to spread the word, sales who are delivering to customers, customer success, finance, which I think people totally overrate in an org. And how do you make all of these work together in harmony without you as a leader doing all these jobs? And a lot of your, like, I found it really valuable to read, it's an old book, but High Output Management.
Yeah. It's just David Howe, right? Bill David Howe, I think. Oh, no, this you're thinking Andy Grove. Sorry.
Yeah, Andy Grove. I loved it because it fit into my own worldview of my job as the founder and CEO is to build a working system.
Yeah, I think that's a great way. I think that dinner that we were at, you were talking about earlier before we started, we're talking a lot about that, right? How do you build your company almost as a self-driving car, and to the point where you can lift your hands from the wheel, and if the company still kind of progresses without you, right? Take a month off, take a week off, whatever it happens to be, then that's a really, really good sign. Now, of course, people and organizations aren't machines, so it's always changing, it's always evolving, and so kind of keeping pace with it and constantly making the changes that you need. But that's a good nirvana or horizon to look forward to say, how do I build the organization as a group of people that are aligned and can just with good intention, right? Hire great folks, all march towards the ultimately the same goal.
And an ad, when you're in high growth, the system changes every 3 to 6 months completely.
That's right. Yeah. Then you got to tear it down and you got to rebuild it. I mean, is that what you're experiencing?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a high growth era, and throw on top of that COVID, like the systems that we used to have, we were like, okay, how can we make these even better?
That's right. Yeah. COVID threw everything off. All the rules are gone, and now you got to rebuild it again.
Teen, you have this framework for this. I remember it was either at our dinner or perhaps it was some podcast, or I can't remember now, but you kind of talked about this notion of climbing the hill, and with every sort of change in scale, whether it was 10 people to 50 to 100, you have this sort of switchback mentality, and I think this is what you're getting at as well, Edith, where it's like, hey, every time we kind of make a switchback, we kind of look as to whether the things that got us here are going to be the things that'll get us to the next switchback. Can you talk about that some more and share some of the ways in which younger entrepreneurs who are not public CEOs today can be learning from that and growing through that process?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple dimensions that I sort of pick. One is you can look at organizational dimensions. If you just assume that on average, each manager has 7 direct reports. You end up having 7, you end up having 49, right? And just do, I think it's 180, 57 or something like that, right? If you do the math. And so about that time, there's another layer that happens in the organization. And whenever there's another layer in the organization, the way you communicate has to change, the way decision-making has to change. And what you ultimately want is you want decision-making, pushed as low in the organization as possible. And definitely not above the second line manager, right? Because the second line manager is close to the work, right? Because you can sort of, know what the individual contributors that whether they're writing code or helping customers, whatever it happens to be, right? And so really getting a sense of that and saying, gosh, there's another layer being created in the organization. And so let me assume that with the decisions that I used to make, I now might need my direct reports to make, right? And my communication channels that I used to do might be more appropriate for the next layer down. I got to figure out, the next thing. It's time to move to a monthly all hands. It's time to move to a quarterly all hands, whatever it happens to be. And then the other is on the business model side. And just a sense that you could do double, you could do triple. I kind of like the tripling. So 1, 3, 10, 30, 100. When you start approaching these things, right, there's something about the business model that you got to retool. Everything that got you there in the previous phase, right, you really have to rethink and say, well, what are the things that have to change as you take the next phase of the journey?
Great. What has been, and I don't want to spend too much time on COVID because there's so many other sort of rich questions kind of independent of the environment that we're in today. But obviously that's a few switchbacks in a very short period of time, some craziness over the last 9 months, and not a lot of clarity in terms of when it's going to be that much better. But what, Edith, as you think about this sort of model of rejiggering your organization as you grow, how did the COVID wrench really change that, and what have you done about that?
It dramatically accelerated our journey to being non-all Oakland. So we started off as a very proudly Oakland company with everybody in Oakland. Already, because of the demands of our enterprise sales, we started having salespeople in other locations. Suddenly, everybody was in another location. That location was their bedroom or their linen closet or wherever people happened to be. So it forced our hand in really thinking about how can we go from, okay, we have some people that aren't in our office to we are truly distributed, and how do we make everybody successful? And one of the people who are always remote actually love it. They're like, for the first time, we can hear all of the all hands, for the first time. What?
Yeah. Well, the remote folks are like, oh, no, it's a big equalizer. Everyone's in the same shoes. And so what have you discovered that you're doing now in COVID that you're like, this is going to be permanent?
Right.
The way you do all hands.
That's exactly what I'm trying to get to.
Just because of the size of the company, like the way we communicate have to be up leveled. We can't assume everybody is around the same water cooler anymore. We have to assume everybody's all over the world.
Yeah. How many people are you now?
Roughly 200. 200.
Yeah. It's a good size. And so, do you find yourself like recording videos to shoot out, or is it a live thing important?
We actually went back to every other week all hands. Just because people wanted that communication channel and wanted, honestly, that sense of community. Yeah.
So one question related to this, and I think as engineers first, I'm sure you can appreciate that for the more introverted employees, engineers in particular, that the last 9 months has been probably easier to get work done. If you think about the more generative work, and I was sort of joking in my last panel how, like, if you think about conference rooms, meetings with a whiteboard, all the things that, I sort of love to use, and you probably both gravitate to as well, you'd have an hour meeting or brainstormer, and then, before people would break up, there'd be whatever, a subgroup of the team that sort of, stays late, gets kicked out of the room, but is kind of like ginning up this prototype that they're going to go build. And that whole kind of generative, more messy kind of creative collision process, it's not natural when you're in a tidy box in Zoom and then everyone hits leave at the same time. How have you guys, either, are you hearing this? Do you see this happening in your own orgs where the sort of more linear work is continuing at pace, but the more generative kind of 0 to 1 stuff is harder to kind of catalyze? And if you're seeing that, how are you actually helping make that happen? Teen, I don't know if this is happening at Zora and how you're handling it.
Yeah, it's I'd rather see it not as a binary thing, but there's a new medium, there's a new environment, right? And within any new environment, new technology, you learn to adapt. Now we're learning to adapt really, really fast because we're forced to. But when things happen more through time, we're learning to use tools like Slack, right? In versus 10 years ago, I mean, like people are texting each other, and so there's always a shift in embracing new work environments that eventually figures it all stuff out. So how can we accelerate that learning, given everything that's happening? And so so as an example, we're learning like everybody else. How do you drive a lot more interactivity? So I'll give you another example. Like we open our weekly staff meetings. And there's usually like a check-in, right, at the end. The meeting hasn't quite started yet. People are late, right? And you just kind of shoot the breeze over a desk. But now Zoom, people like more on time, right? Because these things are more scheduled. You're not trying to travel from place to place. And so we're like, well, how do we spend the first 5 minutes of every meeting just kind of checking in? So we play this game now where everybody has to pick one word, and you put it in Zoom, and we all hit enter at the same time. And it's our way of simulating, okay, that's the mood, that's the mind frame that people are in, just to kind of know, just going to be a lot more aware of each other, right?
I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah, you find other techniques, right? The other thing that we do is it's hard to talk over each other sometimes on Zoom. So tell you what, hey, look, here's the big question. Everybody write an answer down, right? And then we're going to paste it into a single Google Doc together. And then we're going to take a step back and say, gosh, this is what's on everybody's minds, right? And so there's actually ways to use this as an equalizer, where sometimes the introverts, right, get more of an equal voice, and so you want to adapt to the technology, really find the best of that technology, and find continued ways to get the work that you need done.
Yeah,
great thoughts.
I'll add on that it's allowed us. I love everything you said, Tian, and I'm taking some of your ideas and giving you credit.
Sure. You don't have to give me credit, just take the ideas.
It's definitely allowed us to connect to our customers in new ways. Like we're doing remote happy hours for people in Minnesota or London, where otherwise, just frankly, it would have been really hard for us to get there in person. Or people were saying like, I have childcare and otherwise I wasn't going to be able to attend this, but because of Zoom, I can. So
I'm hopping all over countries, right? All over around the world with customer meetings.
Yeah.
Without having to travel. So you look at the calendar, it's pretty amazing how many customer conversations I'm having and how spread out they are, just because of the lack of need to travel.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a trip to London used to be a 3-day commitment. Now it's a 40-minute Zoom call.
Right. Yeah, this notion that being remote used to be a less than is no longer, and in fact, I think it's going to become a greater than. Whether it's Andy Bechtolsheim used to say, the most talented people, or maybe it was Bill Joy, most talented people are actually not in your company, right? Like they're everywhere else, and so now you can hire them from Estonia or from Kentucky or from wherever it is that they are, and that's pretty powerful. So maybe getting back to your founder's journey, when I think about my own experience as an operator and then through the 13 years here at Foundation, it's absolutely clear to me that the bias of history favors those startups that are run by, as long as humanly possible, their founders, whether it's Bezos or Jobs or Mark Benioff, in our portfolio, Reed Hastings or Lynn Jurich. I think they're bringing something to the companies, a level of passion and insight and understanding for the customers, as I think you're saying here, Tien. But because these startups aren't static, because they are growing so quickly and changing, there's this requirement that you as an executive, as a founder, need to continue to level up, at every turn. And I'd love for you each to kind of share some of the ways that you've done that personally, whether it's through coaches or mentors, collaborators. What are the ways in which, for those, for example, who, I think you said this before, Edith, on our podcast when you joined us, like, oh my goodness, like having to brag about yourself was something that like you'd never done before, and how to sell the dream, Tien, as you said before, not selling as a kind of car salesman on the corner, but like really painting the canvas for what you're trying to build. But what are some of the ways that you guys have each learned and grown and continue to grow today?
Edith, you want to go first?
Oh, Tien, I was about to bump it to you.
Look,
sounds like it's you, Edith.
Yeah.
I think it's Jen.
So the founder journey is definitely it's a constant path of self-discovery. You're absolutely right. And just when you feel like, hey, I've got this thing dialed in, right, I'm starting to get comfortable. As soon as you feel that, you're going to wake up tomorrow and something's going to happen, and you realize, okay, the company's at a different thing. And so, what are the big lessons? You got to be willing to change. You got to be willing to have invest in self-awareness, right? And there are moments when you look at the company, you're like, gosh, the company is this way because of me, right? And the good and the bad, right? And you got to be able to confront that and say, well, what do we do about that? Then I would say, leadership in general, especially as you grow a company, you want to seeing a bunch of leaders, hiring a bunch of leaders, right? Is ultimately understanding your strengths, but equally your gaps, right? And having self-awareness of that and saying, look, I could work on my gaps and I should, but ultimately I've got to find great talent in those areas that are far better than me. And then surrounding yourself with people, appreciating what they do, and then truly empowering them, right, to do what it is they need to do. And if people that know how to do that ultimately are able to scale. And so at the end of the day, the self-awareness, the constant learning, and the ability to find great people and learn from them and really empower them.
And what for you, Tien, was the gap where you're like, you know what, I'm going to grow and I continue to gain purchase on this awareness, and then the change and self-adjustment, but I just got to go get the best blank. What was sort of for you as you were going through that founder's journey? What was got to go get this person? I'm just never going to grow fast enough.
Well, the problem with the founders is in the beginning of the company, your vision is so clear. It's a small team, and you're calling the shots, and things move fast, right? Things were moving fast. Whatever you think about, you can make happen because it's a smaller team. But eventually, you got to look and say, look, the company is now at a size where I've never done this before, right? And you talk about all those folks, and if you raise another round, go public, right? Achieve $100 million, all of a sudden it's like, well, I've never actually managed a public company before, right? I've actually never managed a high-powered president of the company that's taken another company public before, right? Whatever it happens to be. And so a recognition of that and saying, look, I'm really learning. For me personally, I remember really early on, I did find a coach, and this coach had a framework for how to look at leadership styles. And he said, look, people sort of lean towards either relationship-driven, vision-driven, or execution-driven, right? Founders tend to gravitate towards the visionary side of it. I mean, that's why they do what they do. And they tend to be weak in one of the other areas. And so I was weak on the relationship dimension, which took me days to figure out, well, what does that even mean, right? And but then the data was really broken down, and there were certain things I just don't necessarily think about because I'm so driven by what I'm seeing as the vision and the thing I want to accomplish. On the execution side, I was average, right? But as the company grows, average isn't good enough anymore, and really finding people that can really drive that level of execution is important. And so understanding your style, understanding your leadership styles, and now when I sit down with a group at a department, I can look at all their different styles and see, are they complementary? Are they really structured to leverage each other's superpowers, right? And ultimately, it's going to be about organizations, and you've got to develop that muscle to think about organizations and how to make organizations successful.
Great insights. Edith, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Tien. I'll walk through our journey from 0 to 200. So 0 was me convincing my co-founder to start the company with me. So that got us to 2, which doubled us immediately. When you're 2 people, you do everything. My joke with my co-founder was I'm the general, but I'm also the person who does the work. And then it's just as you grow, starting to carve out, is this a job that needs to be done, and am I the best person to do it?
That's right. That's great.
Like in the beginning, I did the financial models because it was just an Excel spreadsheet. I'm like, I don't need a finance person. I can do this. I did this before. You get to the point when you're starting to talk about a 10 million, 20 million or more budget. You're like, okay, I 100% need a finance person to do this. And then that finance person needs more people to do it. Same with sales. My co-founder, I did the early sales. you get to a point where you're like, yes, we could do this, but we need a VP to take us from where we are to here, and then to there, and then to there, and then even off how high my hands could grow. So just
every time you do something, the implication is the company is not. And so the company's not learning, it's not growing, it's not developing. And so that's sometimes what I help people think about is you're actually robbing the company, right, from the ability to develop that skill, that muscle, and that talent.
Yeah,
by stepping in yourself.
It's a great way to think about it. It's a great way to think about it. Do you all? I'm thinking maybe wasn't a question I was planning on asking, but it's so relevant to this topic. But as you think about assembling the board around you, back to my point, my hypothesis, which I suspect you either share or have some point of view on about sort of, if you can keep the founders running those companies in the fullness of time, they're going to be extraordinary franchises because you can't hire or bolt on, the intuition that they're bringing with it. And I think about the board work I've done over the years, it's just my job is over and over again to figure out how to support that founder and CEO to get them to grow. Do you think about selecting board members and investors with that lens, like this individual is going to help me grow? How is that sort of, how is that growth and evolution of that concept worked for you all? And as you've raised multiple rounds, taken the company public, taken your kind of private board and turned it into a public board, in your case, team. But how do you think about choosing the right investors in this context?
I think it's very similar to, say, co-founders or early execs or even late stage execs. You want somebody who's aligned, right? And so you want to understand, hey, what is your motivation? What would be a big win for you, right? What gets your juices going, and is it all aligned to where we are? Right, because if it is, then the joint vision will carry us through, the hard times, the tough discussions, right? And obviously, you want something where the chemistry is strong, but the aligned vision has to be strong. And when you don't have an aligned vision, I don't know. I mean, early stage, you hear stories, and certainly not foundation, right? But venture firms that look, I need an exit, right? They're like, okay, but I'm not a short-term, I've got a long-term vision. You got to, okay, well, that's going to create a lot of really, really difficult conversations. And so making sure that the vision is aligned and the values are aligned.
Yeah, I think Chan put it really well. I got very good advice in the early days of treat an investor like a co-founder, and even more carefully because an investor stays on your cap table basically forever.
The co-founder you can't fire.
And that, there's going to be good times, there's going to be bad times, you're going to disagree, you're going to agree, but you have to have at least a common framework of, here is our destination, can we at least talk about this? A mistake I see early stage founders making, who I mentor a lot of, is let me just go get the money and then the investor will leave me alone.
Right.
Yeah, that's the worst thing.
Yeah, because it never works out of, I don't know, Tian, maybe you have some horror stories too of, well, I got the money and now I don't see eye to eye with my investor at all and it's not getting better.
Yeah, no.
That's the worst.
Fortunate. Yeah.
That's the worst pair of rusty handcuffs you can put on a founder. In that case, agree 100%. So maybe back to some of this sort of evolution of yourselves as leaders. When you think about the things you needed to learn and level up on, as a former technical individual engineer, product leader, there were probably a bunch of things you needed to actually unlearn. What were some of those things as you evolved as a kind of going from founder to CEO to kind of scale CEO? I'm curious, Edith, what would resonate for you?
That I might be able to do something better, but that my time is finite. That sure, maybe I could have written something a little bit better, but I can't do everything. And better is sometimes a really loose definition. It might not be exactly how I would have done it, but it could actually be better in many other ways.
Perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my mantra is we got to ship. Like if you wait for the ship, you're never going to ship it.
Yeah.
Right. Particularly in the discipline that you're coming from. So, the CEOs or founders tend to be more critical or be more meticulous about the the discipline from which they rose, whether it's sales or marketing or product and engineering. And so yeah, you have a more critical eye. How about you, Teen? How what are some of the things you had to unlearn or relearn?
I think one of the harder things that engineering types struggle with is the level of ambiguity is really, really high, right? And so you don't really know. And so how do you make decisions? How do you set directions when the level of ambiguity is really high? Sure, like embrace data-driven decisions. All that's absolutely true. And these days, we're surrounded by data, and you can get much better data, and that's absolutely true as well. But you can't fight the fact that the ambiguity is really, really high. Should you hire this person? Should you go in this direction? And so, what you find is if you sort of step back, I think there was a study that followed a bunch of, I think, college students, right, throughout their lives and say, well, what was really the biggest determinant of success? And it turns out it wasn't their education, it wasn't, how smart they were. It was what industry they picked, right? And, not a big surprise because there's macro level trends and there's big themes that ultimately are going to drive the bigger impact. And that's not to say, right, values, culture, right, all that's really, really important because that's certainly one of the big macro level effects. But there's just a few macro level effects that are going to shape your company. And how do you make sure as a founder, because no one else can do that, right? You've got to make the call, you've got to delve into it, and you've got to set the direction. And be comfortable that, okay, if that's the case, then the things that are ambiguous, right, wind up mattering less, right? Because the overriding trends are really going to hopefully drive you, and it gives you a lot more room to make short-term errors as well.
Yeah, one of my sayings is you can't A/B test life. Much as I would like to, sometimes you can't. You can't say, what if I had gone to Stanford instead of Harvey Mudd? What if I'd hired this person instead of this person? You just can't.
That's right.
And then also on top of that, the lack of a decision is a decision. If you're like, I'm not going to hire anybody for 6 months, that's actually paralyzing your business sometimes.
Yeah, that lack of the counterfactual is so hard in our business. Tina, on your comment around the study, I'm curious, is it picking the right market because that market happens to be the one that's really pulling? Or is it picking the right market that's a fit for you as a founder? In other words, the founder market fit versus just that market is crazy hot, therefore I should enter it. Or both.
Well, it's when Michael Jordan, right, tried to play baseball, I mean, he was pretty good, but certainly wasn't like he was playing basketball, right? So I certainly understand where you have your strengths and where you have a competitive advantage is helpful. Otherwise, you're undifferentiated. And so one of the things that you realize, especially small company startup, is you have to be differentiated. Otherwise, you're going to get lost in the muck, right? And so you want to have something that the buyer, the investors, the employees that want to join, or the candidate says, this makes sense. This company is different, and I can see that difference is actually meaningful, right? That ultimately has to be really, really important.
Yeah. I think, this sort of founder market fit, this sort of where's the spike in the founder and how hard do they spike, and how that overlaps with the, what needs to be built in the market opportunity. And there is that timing component to it as well, of course, which is you might be spiking hard, but 5 years early, which is, such a great failure mode in our industry. So I'm going to start weaving in some questions from the audience. So I'd encourage folks, anyone who wants to ask a question of Edith or Teen. But before we get to those, if we go back in time to when each of you was starting your respective companies, what's the kind of most important, one or two pieces of advice that you'd give your younger self at that outset as you look back on it today? Maybe Edith, if you want to go first.
I think I was lucky that I had a lot of very good advisors and I'd worked at startups before, but 0 to 2 years is a really hard time. We took about 2 years to get our early customers up and running because we're creating a category. And to Tian's point about data, when you're getting a customer a month, it's very daunting. You're like, you have this vision of you're going to have this huge success. And it doesn't happen that way. It happens not overnight, but with just like the individual days and weeks of months of helping customers be successful and listening to their feedback, at least in B2B. And you got to have confidence in your vision.
Particularly when people are slamming doors saying, we don't, I mean, in your category, feature flagging was kind of done inside of some company. I mean, if you came from Facebook or Uber, the notion of feature flagging was, people were kind of secret about it. But the rest of the market, they're like, what the hell is this? So I can imagine creating that category was an extra point of friction.
We had two uphill battles, which was people are like, why don't I just build this? And cloud SaaS software as a whole, I don't trust that. Why don't you do it on-prem? And we were so passionate that what we were doing was right and the market had to come to us. And we were right, but it was hard.
Did you feel that in that apartment building team up on Telegraph Hill? That resistance to SaaS?
No, we were all big believers of the internet back in 98, 99. And so it was that really drove us. And so there was a group of folks, right, that really had a common vision that the internet's going to make a big difference in enterprise software. It sounds obvious now, right? But back then it wasn't. And we just wanted to work on that problem. What did it mean to build a product? What does it mean to sell? What does it mean to market? And that really was that singular vision was what brought us together, right? We called it Enter Software. We called it, software should be as easy as buying a book on Amazon, right? Told a bunch of stories. But that was really what aligned us and kept us focused. Yeah.
What for you, as you kind of think about your younger self, maybe it's not in Telegraph Hill because you were still at Salesforce at the time, but
that's right.
At the journey to starting Zora, what do you wish you knew that you know now?
It's always easy with hindsight, right? You can, if I could go back in time, right? I know exactly what sports teams to bet on, what stocks to buy. So it's you don't want to fall too much into that trap. But for lessons, about two things, right? One is I probably had a little bit of a sophomore trap where the second time you do something, you think it's easier because you did it before. You're like, oh, just do what I did before. And it just doesn't turn out that way, right? Everything is different. Every time you do this is very, very different. And so, we rocketed out of the gate pretty fast, hit a vein in the marketplace. But there were things that we had to undo after 6 months. That's like, okay, look, we're a very different company than say Salesforce, and let's really think this thing through. A lot of commonalities, right? And a lot of lessons and skills that we can certainly bring forward, but every situation is different. And the second thing was, looking at the first few years, what we talked about earlier, right? Is I probably, would advise, hey, let go of that founder control thing a little bit earlier, right? In the growth of the company. And really, like what we said, anything that you do, the company doesn't do, right? And being aware of that dynamic. And look, there's certain things that only you can do. You got to go raise the money, right? You got to articulate the vision. There's some tough calls that you got to make, but try to really let the company really grow in that environment.
You're reminding me, years ago, I was teaching a class, Introduction to Entrepreneurship, to 7th and 8th graders. I have this sort of fundamental belief that we're natural born entrepreneurs, and that most of that stuff gets designed out of us over time, risk aversion. And, if you ask a room of 4th graders, who's good at drawing, all the hands go up. Ask the high school students, none of the hands come up, or one of the hands come up. And I was so struck by, sort of this, this notion that you really do just need to kind of let these creative juices flow in these individuals, and some really good things happen. And I was co-teaching the class with this woman who was a trained teacher. She's actually a former Intel engineer, and she I wanted to kind of drop wisdom on these kids, like case studies from Harvard. And she said, no, it's you never want to answer a question that a kid could figure out on his own, because then it's theirs, right? Like it's not some gem that they were taking notes on. And I think your point here is right on that, right? It's like if you're stepping into the breach every time something bad happens, then you're training this system, this organism, to basically come to you with their problems instead of beginning to figure it out. And so that patterning that you're describing feels really, really good. That's great. What else, guys? We've got just a few minutes left, and I know there's a lot of folks who are just admiring what you've built, both of you, and you're at different stages in the journey. Maybe if I could ask just one last question for you to wrap on, was there a scale point? You've talked about this 1 to 8 to kind of 60-ish, and was there a point at which that was particularly hard that you could talk us through? And I know, Edith, you're kind of at 200, which is, that's a hard spot too, right? Particularly in the distributed environment. But which of those scale points was most difficult for each of you, or has been? And what would you share with the entrepreneurs who are kind of coming behind you?
I think about, I'm sure there's other inflection points. I would say the inflection points below 150 employees, we probably blew through pretty well. And that's probably experience in running those size organizations and being at other companies that went through that. We've had 2, and when you look back, we have one that I think we're getting through now, and we have one with about 150 to 200 people. And when you really look back, and the engineer in me, right, tries to say, well, what the heck is going on? Like, how do you debug the system? And then you see that there's just structural things that made total sense at a period in time, and you just outgrew them, and you didn't see it, early enough, right? And so, I've always thought eventually, maybe write a book about this, and it can't just be me because I'm only have one experiences, right? But how do you collectively capture all these things? And maybe that's something, right, that somebody like you guys with a portfolio can really think through, that says, okay, these are the signs, right, that you're about to break through, and take a step back and some kind of audit that you can do in terms of how decisions are made, what type of leaders are running which type of functions, are the cross-functional areas are going to start to, I always thought that just a calendar app can do a quick analysis. And when a department is really spending more time with themselves than with, other departments, that's usually a sign that things are about to break down, right? If you don't have the systems to promote it. And it's always something like that. And then the bigger the company you are, the harder it is to actually transform and redo the systems. But that ultimately is the work.
Yeah, two things that have helped us a lot are our core values of learn and grow and teams, not fiefdoms. Like the way we run the company now at 200 is completely different than when we were 20 people. And that's okay. And I'm really happy that most of the people who are here when we're 20 are still here, but we reinforce every day that we have to look at how we're running meetings. We have to look at how we're running our teams. And it is 100% okay if the stuff that got us this far doesn't work anymore. It's not saying that stuff is bad or out of date. It's just, it's time for it to change again, which really helps with people making that mental jump of, okay, things have to change again, and I'm on board.
Great, great insights. I think you should write a book, first of all, team. I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you that. I also think everyone should read Hastings' No Rules Rules book, because there's some things I think that he covers in there that are pretty consistent with things we talked about here. And then this point around sort of, journey, not destination, I feel like I'm taking away from this as well. And you've kind of, I think, been clear about that, both of you, sort of what's the point on the horizon that we're all aligned over. And if it's big enough and interesting enough, people are going to join you, and they're also going to be able to kind of ride through the near-term ups and downs, the things that don't work, and getting that alignment and that clarity is so important. So I know we're out of time. I'm super grateful. Again, thank you both for joining us for this. It's been a fun conversation to riff with you and hear about your stories and your advice for the next generation of entrepreneurs trying to build companies, hopefully anywhere close to as successful as yours. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Edith. It's great to talk.
All right.
And nice to talk with you all.